At a time when corruption is an issue upon which governments rise and fall, it's not an exaggeration to say that Transparency International is one of the world's most vital civil society organizations. With chapters in over 100 countries and enviable global brand recognition, TI often sets the standard by which elected officials, the private sector, and international organizations are held accountable. My colleague Frank Vogel, who co-founded TI 24 years ago, will give Delia a proper introduction shortly. But first I'd like to say a few words about CIPE, where incidentally we're honored to have another TI founder on our board, Michael Hirschman. As a business institute, CIPE is keenly aware of the cost of corruption and its effect on investment and competitiveness. If we're truly going to make the promise of globalization and development come true, we have to help both private sectors fight corruption and work with the private sector on the more effective ways of controlling and preventing it within the firm. One of CIPE's core objectives is to improve governance through transparency and accountability in the public and private sectors. And that gives CIPE a lot in common with TI. Over the years, we've worked effectively with TI chapters in countries as diverse as Lebanon, Indonesia, and Mexico. One example is a program from several years ago where we looked at public procurement practices in 4 countries from a private sector point of view. Working with TI chapters in those 4 emerging market nations, CIPE performed a gap analysis on the difference between government procurement laws on the books and the reality on the ground. The data from the business community established the facts and formed the basis for awareness-building campaigns. More recently, CIPE has begun formal collaboration with the Global Anti-Corruption Consortium led by TI and the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. You'll be hearing more about that later from our speakers. CIPE's counterparts at TI, whether at the international headquarters in Berlin or in chapters worldwide, are frequent informal collaborators and a reliable source of solid information and ideas. Every 2 years, CIPE staff look forward to attending TI's International Anti-Corruption Conference, held most recently in Panama, Malaysia, and Bali, Brazil. The corruption nerds in the audience may see a pattern there between these conference venues and corruption scandals: Panama, Malaysia, and Brazil. In 2018, the conference will be in Denmark. Let's see how that turns out. In short, CIPE and TI have a rich, productive history of cooperation. And based on all I've heard from Delia about her plans, we have a future for tremendous potential. With that in mind, let me hand things off to Frank Vogel, who, as I mentioned, had a hand in TI's original creation and is helping to shepherd it into a new chapter. I would be remiss in not mentioning that Frank is also a co-founder of the Partnership for Transparency Fund, a co-sponsor of today's event. Frank, I'll hand the floor to you.
Well, good morning, and thank you, Andrew. And before I read you the 25-page resume of Delia that I know you all want to get in great detail, let me just say a couple of little points. First, thank you so much to CIPE, to you, Andrew, to Frank Brown, and all your colleagues here for organizing this. Can you hear me at all? You can't hear me. Oh. They switched me off. Sorry. Hello? Are we here? Good morning. I'll start again. Oh, you don't want me to talk about the 25-page resume that I'm going to read? Okay. I'd like to thank you very, very much at CIPE for doing this. The Partnership for Transparency Fund, of which we've got numerous distinguished members here in the audience, was started about 16 years ago. It works across the world. We have affiliates in Asia, in Africa, and in Europe. I see corruption very much in terms of security, in 2 simple branches: strategic security and human security. I think that's the way it makes sense today. The PTF is right at the cutting edge, working with so many local civil society organizations on the human security side of corruption, helping people in villages and small communities to escape the curse of corruption so they have better lives and can live in dignity. TI, through its national chapters, does that, of course, in a major way. At the same time, it gets into the international security area. One of the jewels of the crown in TI is its defense and security division, now with a staff of over 20 people, that's probably the leader in the area of corruption and security. What bridges both human and security aspects of corruption are two issues: justice and money and politics. And this is where Delia Ferreira Rubio really is preeminent. She comes from Argentina. She has law degrees from the University of Cordoba, and then she got her doctorate from the University in Madrid in law. She then worked in government, for government in Argentina. She was a senior advisor to members, representatives, and senators in the Congress of Argentina. And she is today an independent consultant and a global pioneer in the very complex and vital issue of tracking money and politics and elections. And it's an issue I think is core to the theme today of sustainability, of approaches to reforming countries which have serious problems of corruption. Delia has served in the past as the chair of TI's national chapter in Argentina. She has been on the board of directors of the international TI organization for 6 years, up until 2014. And this October, a number of people convinced a somewhat reluctant Delia and said, you've got to stand for the chair of the International Board of Directors for a 3-year term. We have contested elections in TI. Delia won with a very strong majority in October. It was a very exciting annual meeting. And so she's now here making her first speech in the United States with this new title of chair of the TI board. So I'd like to welcome Delia Ferreira Rubio to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Oh, you need this microphone.
I have my.
Oh, you have your mic.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you, SAC, for organizing this meeting, and PTF also for co-organizing, and Frank for having the idea. I was in DC for another professional meeting, but Frank says you have to talk to us. My first message is why I am fighting against corruption for many, many years with different heads and different positions. And the fact is that I think that fighting for transparency is fighting for democracy. That's my main objective. When you fight for transparency, you fight for rule of law, you fight for rights, you fight for freedoms, and you fight for good governance. That's why I am here fighting for corruption, for anti-corruption in TI. And the fact that we are together is that we were talking about how to sustain the fight against corruption. And in order to get to that probable answer, I would start by saying that there are some trends that are new in the corruption sphere in many, many countries in the last years. And when we focus on that trends, we are clear about the challenges that we have to face. So I will go through the trends I have identified, particularly in my region, but it is the same in other regions of the world, and then we can go to how to face these challenges. The first thing is that although we have been working for anti-corruption and transparency for many, many years with many partners, corruption is still there and it's still a problem. And corruption has not diminished, really. It has changed the faces of the phenomenon, but according to our corruption perception index, for instance, the average between the 100, which means perception of absolute transparency, to 0 perception of absolute corruption, the average in the world is 43 points. So it's not a great result. Of course, we have the usual suspects at the high level of transparency and also at the bottom line of the index. But the average is what is really important here, because we have lots of things to do in terms of corruption. If you look at the map where Transparency International shows the perception index, the red is really overwhelming. So we have lots of things to do. Second trend is the appearance of grant corruption as a new form of corruption. It is corruption, but now it is pervasive. And the problem with grant corruption is that it is an aggravated form of corruption because of many things, because of the amounts of money that it is involved in grant corruption, because of the actors involved, which means high-level public officials and very important business persons in the private sector. Because also of the serious consequences that grant corruption had for the state, for the society, for the citizens, and for the governance structure in a country and the possibilities of development in that country. Because grant corruption may lead, and in many cases it has led, to capture of state. And one thing is the capture of state by big money interests, and another very different thing is capture of state in schemes of grant corruption, which are really organized crime schemes within the state. So this problem is now pervasive in many regions of the world, and we have to find new tools and new measures to fight this new form of corruption. And in America, the Odebrecht scandal in Brazil and spreading all over Latin American countries and even Angola in Africa is a good example of what I am talking about when I talk about grant corruption. The third tendency, and it's very clear also, is people mobilization. We have witnessed massive, really massive mobilizations of people fighting against corruption. They are no longer saying we are against this leader or this party. We are against corruption. We are fed up with corruption. And this is clear from Ukraine to Guatemala or Honduras or Brazil. This is a new energy there. And we have to find the channels to the channels or the tools in order to channel this new energy when the indignation stage is calm. We have the energy there of the population. We need people engagement, and we need people on board in the fight against corruption. The fourth tendency is that judiciary is reacting now. In many countries, for many years, we have had impunity. And now we are seeing that judges are, in a way, reacting and starting to stop impunity. The problem is the sustainability of this new trend. And the ways in which the judiciary is reacting is not always the same, and it varies from countries to countries. We have the example of some champions within the judiciary fighting corruption, just champions. The most known case now in America is Judge Moro in Brazil, and the former public general prosecutor Janot, also in Brazil. Janot has ended his mandate. Now the new prosecutor is more close to the government, and that's the challenge when we have champions leading the fight against corruption from the judiciary. In other countries, the reaction has come from ad hoc in so-called international institutions, like the case in Guatemala with the CICIG, or nowadays in Honduras, the MASI, which are commissions working with the judiciary in in the research leading to cases of corruption against very important leaders. In the case of Guatemala, under the umbrella of United Nations. In the case of Honduras, under the umbrella of the Organization of American States. And the third way in which the judiciary is reacting now is through ordinary judges. The same judges that have done almost nothing before are now acting like they have woken up now and they are starting to work. And this path through no impunity poses particular changes, particular challenges also to the fighters against corruption, because how we sustain this fight if the same judges that haven't done anything before now are acting. We don't know what they will do in the future, so there's another challenge there. The fifth tendency is the acknowledgement now that, as we say in Argentina, corruption is like tango. You need two to tango. And for many, many years, we have concentrated our fight on public officials. But nowadays, we are seeing very important business persons convicted and sanctioned because of their participation in corruption schemes. And we have also seen that private sector is now working in strengthening their own integrity structures and their own compliance structures, because they are now seen as part of the problem. They have ever been part of the problem because it's two parts in corruption. But nowadays, the reaction is also facing the private sector, and that's another trend that is very visible in the fight against corruption. The other trend has to do with what Frank says in terms of campaign finance. Campaign finance is at the core of corruption problem in all the countries, with all the systems. No matter what law we have the problem of campaign finances. No matter what structure for controlling money or following the money we have in place, we have the problem of money and politics there, and this reflects on possible corruption schemes afterwards. So it's an unending story fighting money and politics relations leading to corruption. But nowadays we have another actor in this field which poses particularly challenge for the fight against corruption in money and politics, which is the introduction of organized crime resources in politics. And in many countries this is the reality nowadays. And when organized crime starts financing campaigns at the very high levels or at the local levels, we have something different from the challenge we had for years when we talk about campaign finance. We were concentrated in big money, big cuts, putting money and controlling then political decisions or public policies. But now we have an actor which needs to be faced or approached with new tools, because just putting or passing laws is not the way to stop organized crime from giving money to politics. You can say, as many countries has now passed laws in many countries, saying corporate actors cannot give contributions to political campaigns. And for legal corporate business, that's a rule and they shall obey. But passing a law saying that organized crime cannot give money to politics is almost an useless tool, because of the business of this organized crime guys is precisely illegally. So illegality is the business, so just passing laws is not the response. And the tools that the agencies created to control money and politics are not enough to control organized crime money coming into politics. We have to think about new tools and new measures. And finally, I think that anti-corruption fighters are not alone. Our fight is like playing chess. The black pieces also play. They play too, and they are very active now. We have seen in the past 2 months attempts to generate pardons to persons involved in corruption cases. We have seen attempts to destroy or repeal the laws that regulate anti-corruption agencies or bodies in many countries. We have this week the case of Ukraine. Fortunately, they have stopped now, but they are trying to stop and to counter what we are doing in terms of corruption fights. And how can we make the fight against corruption sustainable in this situation I have been mentioning? I think we have to work in institutionalization of measures and tools. Champions are important, but they are not sufficient. They are not enough. It is necessary to create the institutions or to strengthen the institutions we have already created, particularly in relation to the judiciary and the controlling agencies and the anti-corruption offices in many countries. We have to guarantee independence. We have to guarantee that they have the capacity to perform and delivery. That means resources and personnel and technological capacity to face the problem. And we also have to grant them legal authority, really, to act. In many countries, these kind of organizations, anti-corruption offices or bureaus or the controller's office are created. They have some budget, but bank secrecy can be opposed to them when they ask a question or when they are doing an investigation. Or, for instance, tax secrecy or fiscal secrecy is other obstacle that they face. So we have to remove this kind of legal curtails of the authorities. Second, laws and rules are necessary again, but not enough. And nowadays we have to concentrate, I think, in implementation and enforcement. For many, many years, we, the fighters against corruption, have worked in the creation and passing of laws. We have the laws now. We have the agencies. We have the controller offices. We have the procedures. We have to make that work. And that means working on implementation. I would underline this commitment for the anti-corruption community. In the third place, we have to channel, as I said before, popular energy in the post-indignation stage. We have the people fighting against corruption in the streets. In many countries, this has meant that presidents or vice presidents had to resign, and probably they are in jail now. But we have to channel this energy. Our last global corruption barometer, states that 70% of the people is willing to do something against corruption. We have to create the channels that guarantee the possibility of this energy to be used in the fight against corruption. It is important to create the appropriate channels for participation in terms of access to information, in terms of whistleblower protection, in terms of using technology as a factor for people involvement, for people engagement, for instance, in public service monitoring, for instance, in public policies design. We have to create this new challenge, and it is also important that we work with the aim in mind that we have to show some results for people to be engaged. Because just saying in 20 years we will not have corruption in this country is not enough to engage people in the fight. We have to make people realize that there is a link between corruption and ordinary life of ordinary citizens, because it's we, the ordinary citizens, that are the victims of corruption, even of grand corruption. So we have to make that link very clear and to offer afterwards the channels to engage people in participation in the fight against corruption, offering something that they can see as a result, some change that they can perceive in their ordinary life when we fight together against corruption. The other problem I think we have to face in order to make this fight sustainable is to work to strengthen integrity. Integrity in the public sector, but integrity also in the private sector. Because this is the basis of the fight for transparency. The values that are there, the integrity that is the fundamentals of any society as consensus on what is right and what is wrong. And particularly in this area of integrity, I think that we have to work very hard on conflicts of interest. In many, many countries, this is the biggest problem in terms of integrity. We have worked in many countries establishing public ethics laws. Staying there with the force of law that public servants must be honest, which is really a very simple truth, but we have to put it in law because it was not so clear for many that it was the problem, and it was the duty of public servants to act honestly. But after creating this kind of law, we have to be very concentrated on the conflicts of interest, particularly when we have revolving doors of people going from private to public, from public to private sector, always in the same field of the economy. So this is a crucial point nowadays in many countries. And in the long term, I think we have to work on education. The results won't be seen very quickly. But if we don't start now, in 20 years, we will be here, I will be very old, talking about the same things. We have to create the basis, the social basis for transparent society and for good governance, and for public servants to be public servants and not private businessmen within the state. And this is kind of a complicated thing, because we have to rebuild very basic consensus on what is right and what is wrong. I remember the first paragraph of the report of the Nolan Commission, which approached the problem of some corruption cases in the UK Parliament some years ago, before the first public ethic law was passed there. And the first paragraph says, we have found out, the commission was created because of corruption cases, we have found out that the parliamentarians are not very clear regarding what is right and what is wrong. Whether it is right to use the premises of Westminster for particular parties or meetings, or whether it is okay for parliamentarians to pass the bills of the gardeners to the parliament to pay for that bills. They are not clear about that. So we will start saying what is right and what is wrong with the strength of the law. That's the origin of a complete way of addressing corruption, which are called the juridization of the ethics, because ethics is not law. And when we study law, we are very clear between the two fields of rules. Some are the legal ones and some are the moral ones. But when we talk about public ethic laws, what we have done is to put that moral things with the force and the strength of the legal side of the rules. So this is a process because we are not clear about this basic values consensus among society. And we have to rebuild that, and that means education, not only formal, I mean education, in example, in informal ways to engage the young in this fight for them to be ready when they are public servants, not to be told the essential things because they are aware of what is right and what is wrong. And in a nutshell, my formula for anti-corruption sustainability is the following. We need more information, we need more integrity, we need less impunity, and we need less indifference on the part of society. Thank you very much.
First, let me introduce the rest of our panel. Alina Manju-Pipidi is a professor of democracy studies at the Hertie School of Governance in Berlin, and probably well known to most of you in this room. Her research centers on anti-corruption policy and good governance. Alina chairs the European Research Center for Anti-Corruption and State Building, and in that capacity she has conducted an ongoing series of case studies of what anti-corruption interventions are effective and why. It's all part of the largest anti-corruption research project conducted to date. She's authored several books on the subject, and her work has really become a must-read for practitioners and donors. And this one, for example, that we've got right here, Transitions to Good Governance, is really a must-read here at SITE. A lot of our staff are using this as a touchstone in their work. I'm also pleased to introduce Frank Brown. He is our Value Chain and Anti-Corruption Program Team Leader here at SITE. Working with a core group of colleagues, Frank takes an innovative approach to reducing the corrupt practices of local firms in emerging markets, some of which you were talking about, Delia, in terms of trying to get build greater compliance within the private sector. The basic idea of SITE's approach is to build upon the obligations of multinational firms to comply with the U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and other anti-corruption legislation around the world. And this helps local firms working in very high corruption environments. It gives them the tools they need and the arguments they need to fight back. Frank has overseen the program, the overlaunch of a new program to create an anti-corruption in transition hub here at SITE to help build resources available to countries with leadership newly empowered to reduce the systemic corruption. So Frank will talk about that a little later, but the idea being is when you go into when you get an opportunity, let's say Ukraine a few years back, how do we quickly mobilize resources to civil society and other groups within a country to help them take on an issue when there's still scope and room to operate before groups have a chance to sort of recoagulate, if you will, in a new environment. Delia, I'm going to start with a question to you. We were talking a little bit earlier this morning before the session about technology, and certainly you in your remarks you pointed to how technology is helping us in governance and other practices. I was wondering if you could share some of your thoughts on the issue that we should be thinking about in terms of both the trend lines in the application of technology, but perhaps also some of the challenges we should be thinking about as we move forward.
I think the technology is very useful and can help, for instance, in these people engagement participations through apps that has been created, or technology in access to information, which really make information accessible and usable by the people, the researchers, the journalists. And also in e-procurement, technology has helped to incorporate the informal sector to the formal economy. Frank was talking about that this morning, and to guarantee some fairness in the assignment of or the resolution of public procurement. But I think that there is a fashion now regarding particularly blockchain. Everybody's talking about blockchain. They present blockchain as the panacea that will resolve all the problems. And I think that we have to be very careful because this can help in terms of the security of the information, but we have another problem, which is what I call the algocracy, the algorithm governance and government over our lives, and who is really holding the power there, who is the owner of the cloud. Many people say, my documents are safe because I have them on the cloud, or in the cloud, or over the cloud, whatever it is, because nobody knows, and really the cloud is the computer of someone else. And who is this someone else? Who is governing the use of that information? So we have to be very careful in order to not to be surprised because of the results of applying this technology that may curtail our liberties and freedoms and may guarantee that our information and sensible data is in the hands of the improper persons or governments or whatever it is. So that was my concern regarding technology in the future.
I wouldn't mind getting your views on sort of an extension of that issue, and that is the border between what we might call secrecy and privacy.
Mm-hmm.
So certainly, when we all talk about sunshine being the best disinfectant, but I think there is a broader debate in terms of whether companies are holding our data or governments are holding our data or our data is in the cloud, about trying to find the right balance
Mm-hmm.
between access to information and the right to privacy.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is, I've been experiencing this in some of the debates when we talk about tracking financial flows that kleptocrats may have taken out of a country, the use of data that might be hacked from, say, the Panama
Mm-hmm.
Papers
Yeah.
or the other sources. Where do you see this debate on privacy versus secrecy, on access to information headed in the future? And what should we be thinking about in those terms?
I think that the balance is difficult and has always been difficult between information and privacy, even before technology. This is a great debate in the legal sphere. I think that we have to be careful in order to prioritize the interests that are involved in the question. Sometimes there is a public interest in terms of knowing who is the beneficial owner or of a company, a bank account or whatever it is, in order to track the money, to follow the money when we fight against corruption, and that's important. But we have to have also very clear that there are certain limits related to privacy, to the privacy of persons, and the circulation and use of this sensible information, as some laws identify it, not just individual information, but sensible information regarding health, for instance. And sometimes governments are really hungry for data, and they are gathering lots of data, and I'm not sure what they are doing with that data. And when artificial intelligence came into the picture, I think we have a problem that we have to be aware of and to be preoccupied and occupied on that problem, because if we don't start looking at that now, we will face problems in the future in terms of liberties and rights.
In your term as TI's chair moving forward, I mean, you've charted very, I think, effectively and holistically the challenges that the organization is facing, the solutions that are at hand. What strategic role does TI Berlin have to play in moving this forward?
Well, you know that our chapters, we have chapters in more than 100 countries, one per country, and we have also 30 individual members. Our members are autonomous in the decision of in what way and the particular situation they are working in, they will fight against corruption. The TIS Berlin office, let's say, work in the coordination of these chapters and initiatives. In the international programs, some programs are led by the Secretariat in Berlin, and also we work in the establishing of standards and best practices and general tools that can be applied by the chapters, adapted to the particular situation of each country in order to fight corruption in different areas. And of course, the research team in Berlin is in charge of our corruption perception index, the global barometer, and other reports that we make. They are concentrated in Berlin.
Elena, I'd like to now turn to you. One phrase from your most recent book jumped out at me. You wrote that no country has yet achieved control of corruption due to international assistance and its standard prescriptions, though a few have succeeded on their own. Yeah, that's pretty strong stuff, especially in a town like Washington, where we like to think we can go and give people the magic prescription sometimes. Can you elaborate a bit on your views on that regard?
Well, thank you for this question. So I would say that, a simple counterfactual comes to mind. If you know a country which, due to international influence, has evolved from having corruption as norm to corruption as exception, because that is actually the real evolution, that one that we are about, and it's very difficult to get there, please name it. Because for my first Cambridge University Press book, A Quest for Good Governance, I didn't have enough case studies. I work a lot as a statistician, and I develop new indicators, not perception indicators, but fact-based indicators. For instance, indicators based on social allocation, on procurement, on fiscal spending, subnational transfers, in order to understand if money are distributed as they should be, universalistically, or they are channeled by particular interests. So I have quite a lot of data, and I was looking, and I have this data for, let's say, 15 years, and in these 15 years, there were nearly no achievers. So what did I do to come up with this? I had to go back 150 years, so in the end, the book is made of historical case studies. For some examples, I even went back to the Italian Middle Ages to look what people do, how people build control of corruption in the absence of modernity. Because let's face it, we are trying to build control of corruption in many countries of the world which are not modern. We have tried to make them modern for 100 and more years, and in fact we failed. In fact, I think we produced pathologies of pretenses of modernity which are worse than having led those societies to continue on some sort of organic path. And then there are the contemporary case studies of success, which for the past 35 years, there are about 7 of them. There is, of course, the notorious Chile in Latin America, and I managed to add up Uruguay, and more recently, I think Costa Rica is getting there. There's Botswana in Africa, there's South Korea and Taiwan in Asia, and there's Estonia and hopefully Georgia in Europe. Because the second thing is that it has to be sustainable. The first condition is move from corruption as norm to corruption as an exception. This is difficult enough, on the basis of these objective indicators, very strongly correlated, by the way, with perception ones, extremely strongly correlated. I can tell you who evolved from last year or in the last years. Actually, I have a chart here for who's interested in this. And if you would look, all the achievers, we have 5 achievers or something globally, they are achievers in the lowest scale. Nobody really managed to move past the threshold where corruption becomes an exception. And I'm very proud, for instance, for people who work in Indonesia. Yes, Indonesia moved a little bit, great. It's there, but it's not yet there where you're free of worry, because free of worry means sustainability, means that for 15, 20 years, you find that this norm becomes enshrined and there is capacity. And in these success cases, I can say that there is definitely outside influence, important outside influence. Now, Georgia is reformed by a president who returned after being a lawyer in the United States and who had brought with him a bunch of people educated abroad and who had these high ideals of emulation. They wanted their country to be like Estonia, or Estonians wanted to be like the Finnish. And again, so there was an important Western influence. In South Korea, you find lawyers who are educated in Japan or in United States, but it's emulation. It's not somebody else coming, putting you conditions, giving you money to do this. This, unfortunately, there is absolutely no success example. On the contrary, I can tell you that the largest grant given for rule of law ever to somebody. The EU has given to Turkey for rule of law. We gave them nearly €1 billion for the past 10 years. And I think Ukraine is the absolute achiever in terms of receiving grants for anti-corruption globally. And I'm desperately trying to find Ukraine, since I helped build the Chesno coalition, so I work in Ukraine. And Ukraine is not on our achievers. It hadn't really moved significantly yet.
Mm-hmm.
So how should those of us who are on the support side of the anti-corruption equation, be looking about how we engage in countries then, or what kind of assistance we provide? What lessons can we implement then?
Well, what I argue is that it wouldn't hurt for a start to have a good theory of change, of why control of corruption gets built in general. I mean, we start from the very wrong premise that actually corruption is an exception, and that government by default is honest, and that people who have power distribute equally to everybody, when actually, I'm a social psychologist, so for me it's easier to acknowledge that it's actually the other way around. Control of corruption is an exception, which appears at the end of a very long scale, which exists only in a minority of countries in the globe. Most societies are organized as patron and client, so it's not even easy to say who is a victim and who is actually profits out of corruption. It's not true that ordinary people don't profit out of corruption. If they would not, it would not be so difficult to defeat in elections client-based parties, which are very, very strong. Okay, and if somebody appears with a complete saying that it's going to clean a society of corruption, then it's probably going to be a populist who's going to do more harm than good. All right, so we have to understand that what we have to build is integrity, and we eliminate corruption gradually. How do we eliminate corruption gradually? By eliminating these power asymmetries, by removing monopolies, by taking the power from bureaucrats who put red tapes just in order to get rents for people to pay them. And this is something which I think SAIPE, for instance, does a lot, but which has got quite neglected in the past 15 years. So what we do at my research center in Berlin, helped by the fact that we have an extraordinarily large number of students. I was thinking when Michael Johnson, American political scientist, who's a pioneer of corruption studies, visited us recently, and he said, that you have become like the largest center in the world studying corruption. I didn't realize this, but indeed we have over 60 graduate students in master and doctoral programs who only work on corruption. And we also help PI when we can, now and then, to provide free research on various areas. And of course we have EU who funds us. So what we do is that we take various interventions, we document them in as large number of countries as possible, and then we looked if countries which had certain policy intervention changed more than countries which didn't. And then we also order case studies, because we're limited by, change indicators in corruption are difficult to find. And what Delia said earlier, that yes, we sold a lot of laws to everybody. Yes, everybody adopted a lot of laws. So currently, more corrupt countries are significantly associated with more anti-corrupt legislation.
Yeah.
While countries in the world which actually are controlling corruption the best, like Denmark, Netherlands, Sweden, actually they have very little integrity regulatory framework, because obviously they didn't get there by adopting a lot of laws. They got there by very strong normative constraints. If you have seen the fabulous TV show with the Iceland, the day when Panama Papers came out, and when all Reykjavik discovering that the name of the prime minister was there, they never expected, him to be sent to jail, or let alone, some sort of judicial decision. All Reykjavik, 1 million people, was on the main square, saying a prime minister of this country should not have its name in the Panama Papers, so he had to resign until the evening after he first very arrogantly stated that he didn't do anything wrong. That's normative constraints. That is actually how control of corruption was built. All right, and this is something there where, despite the fact that there is investment in civil society, which is something where I do not think that we have made a lot of progress. I mean, in how many countries of the world, since we are in the House of SAIPE, in how many countries in the world is business playing, for instance, the role that business played in 18th century Britain, when free market became what we used to think of it, like a temple of impersonalism, where it's not government, but actually market rules which determine the prices. I don't know of any such cases. Where are the businesses in the vanguard of corruption? I ask myself, maybe it's a fantastic difference in circumstances of time, actually replicating a very famous paper in Brazil, which looked at audit. Brazil has this extraordinary audit of municipalities, which is one of the best things that they do. And what she looked is now she had time series of 25 years where they controlled and found mayors corrupt, and she tried to understand if after horizontal accountability, the audit found mayors corrupt, after courts sentenced mayor for corruption, has corruption really gone down? And the answer is not. Is that in the same environments where corruption actually was strong, new mayors became corrupt in their term. And what makes a difference between areas where this happened and what doesn't happen? It's basically the strength of local civil society. It's the normative constraints that civil society, including business, but business quite importantly, manages to put not only in elections, but between elections, in the permanent process of governing, spending, and the rest.
Okay, I'm glad I'm moderating this and not being put on the hot seat. Frank, Alina has lit a fire under your chair as the representative of the private sector today, and so I'm going to ask you to comment on Alina's observations, and Delia, and then I'm going to come back to you and ask you to comment, and then we'll open it up to the audience.
That's a lot to digest. But maybe I should just start in the beginning. And so one of the reasons that we're all here today is that SIPE launched a program about 9 months ago aimed at addressing precisely many of the issues that Alina and Delia have laid out. In other words, there are proven methods to fighting corruption, but those proven methods are often not applied. And from SIPE's sort of firsthand experience in Ukraine in 2014, witnessing our partners, many of them SMEs and entrepreneurs, taking to the streets, demanding change in one city, taking the radical action of demanding to have the right to veto who would head up the local tax inspectorate. I think it was in Kharkiv. So witnessing that sort of, as you put it, Delia, the indignation stage, and the extraordinary energy and the incredible literacy that the populace has at that moment on corruption issues, and making it sustainable. And so we crafted a project around that quandary, and we reached out to folks like you, Alina, for guidance in how to proceed. And what we're gradually doing is building up what we hope is a sort of silo breaking effort to work collectively with folks not just in the business sphere, but in labor and environment, at democracy organizations and organizations that are purely representing business interests, but business interests that benefit from a level playing field. And reaching out to the big donors and saying, look at Afghanistan and what happened there. Let's take some lessons, and let's think clearly about how we devote resources, and perhaps sometimes think about not devoting resources, and using other means. So all of what you say makes perfect sense. It fits into what we are taking the baby steps in trying to address, but there's a tremendous amount of work to do. I personally am optimistic because in my lifetime, I have never witnessed a time when there's been so much interest in this issue. Often it's a primal sense of injustice, that something's not right in the world, and that thing is corruption, or that is corrupt. And how do I act upon that instinct? And I think part of what we're doing is laying out the framework for that action in a constructive way that's not grounded in sort of populist solutions that have been proven ineffective, but it's grounded in the sort of organic mechanisms that we've seen work in the past. And I head off tomorrow morning for Indonesia, where the KPK is this sort of omnipotent anti-corruption agency with a 95% conviction rate. It's an extraordinary thing. But it's a very, very big country. They only have 1,500 workers. It's a great place to work, but it's a small organization. They put on an annual conference, and they've decided to adopt ISO 37001 as the standard. They've decided to require that certified integrity officers play a role in legal entities. They've given 80 pages of instruction on what a certified integrity officer does. So you can just imagine that's sort of an extreme example of what, Alina, you were talking about, where the degree of regulation is such, and the the power to actually enforce that is such that it's a recipe for a much worse situation. So this is a never-ending pattern. I think all of us here, or many of us here, are committed to stopping the pattern in some way, and I'm grateful to be part of the conversation.
Delia, how do you react to some of the
Oh,
women's observations?
it was very, very interesting, and we share many of our points. I will take this ordinary citizens profiting from corruption, but I'm not sure that ordinary citizens really profit from corruption. The problem is that they react against corruption, they are indignated against corruption, but then when the elections come, they decided to the option they voted for on the principle of they steal, but even they do something, or in Spanish, roban pero hacen. And if the principle is they steal but they do, and we keep on voting for them, it's not that the population profit from corruption, but they don't care in that. They don't make the link of the reaction against corruption and the decisions that they have the opportunity to take when we vote for someone and when we participate really in the fight against corruption. So I find this very interesting, and of course your mention of the constraints which are really effective. That's what I meant when we talk about educating the education effort in terms of fighting corruption as a sustainable bet I would make. But it will take a lot of time. It's in the long run. We have to do the two things in parallel. We have to fight corruption now with the tools in order to stop the patterns or the systemic way, or transforming, as you say, corruption from a norm into corruption as an exception. That would be very successful if we can do that in general. But we have to start working in education for the future. If not, in 20 years, we will have the same discussion here.
Okay, I think we have a microphone that we can circulate out. A lot of hands shooting up already. We'll start on this side here, and then working our way from the back. The gentleman at the very back, and then let's take two or three questions at once. And if you can just identify yourself and your organization.
Hi, Rachel Oswald.
Stand up, please. We can.
Rachel Oswald, Congressional Quarterly. Thank you for a great panel. I did hear a lot of talk about the kind of shadow financial system that the Panama Papers and Paradise Papers highlighted. I hear you talking about how anti-corruption reform must come from within, but what role does the international financial system in countries like the United States play when they provide so many opportunities for money laundering to happen at kind of the grand corruption scale that you were talking about earlier? And so what role should developed wealthy countries play in making it more difficult to like anonymously hide your money?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and then at the very back here, there's a gentleman by the wall here.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for Sai, and thank you for the panel, and Dr. Delia for the nice presentation. My name is Haitham Karar. I'm a graduate student at SAIS, School of International Service, American University. I'm very concerned about corruption from the angle of poverty alleviation. That's why I came from tackle corruption. So of course, like 20% of annual GDP of Africa is going to corruption.
Mm-hmm.
And my country is one of the examples. It stands second in Africa, just ahead of Somalia.
Uh-huh.
So, Sudan. I'm from Sudan, yeah. So my question to all of you, how do you envisage to tackle corruption in a country like Sudan, where corruption is protected by the government itself? Of course, EI has a lot of information about that. So what is the entry level in fighting corruption in a country like Sudan? And I believe governance side is very important. To my understanding right now, last week, a couple of weeks ago, the president of Sudan he visited Russia, he asking for protection. And there is a fact that Russia and China, they are not supporting or they are not imposing countries to fight corruption. So how do you find this, and how you can envisage pushing countries or big economies in also following this line, trying to impose countries to fight corruption and reduce corruption in their countries?
Thank
so
you,
much.
and we'll take one more. Just right there, one back.
Yeah, I'm Laurie Sherman. I was a volunteer with TIUSA and actually helped write the site procurement report. I've just come back from 2.5 years in Serbia as the anti-corruption advisor at the OSCE mission, and I tried really hard to get the private sector interested in adopting anti-corruption programs, and had very little success because there is almost no incentive. The only incentive is if you want to be a distributor agent for an FCPA or a UK anti-bribery company. How do we find ways to provide incentives to companies in countries like Serbia where they don't prosecute bribery, and it just, there's no real incentive to being clean? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to link two of these questions because I think they both have international connotations. The first being the role of Western financial institutions, Western legal institutions, as potential facilitators of money flows, at least. I don't know if we can accuse them of being facilitators of corruption, but at least of transfer of resources to where they are secured. And the second question is the role of, shall we say, authoritarian capital on corruption and rule of law issues. When Russian capital arrives in a country, say Serbia, or Chinese development aid arrives, or Chinese private sector arrives, they're not asking questions. They're not demanding improvements in governance. There may be even questions about how these deals get done in the first place. So how do we look at both of these institutions as members of civil society? What is it that we can be doing to both shine the light but also propose solutions to these issues? And then Frank, I think that last question is directly for you. What are sort of the non-value chain incentives we can think about in terms of the private sector? So, Delia?
Okay, thank you for the questions and for participating in this conversation, really. I think you have a very good point, because there is some kind of hypocrisy from very important financial centers, receiving the money without saying anything, and keeping the money even for long terms, because they produce revenues, instead of facilitating asset recovery from the countries where the money comes from. So I think we have to work on that, because many financial institutions in the very good positioned countries in our corruption perception index are in fact actors in the corruption that appears in the lower bottom part of the index. So we have to fix that in a very efficient way. It will be difficult, but for instance, our chapter in France has been very successful in trying to stop of Young, the son of the dictator, in terms of laundering the profits or the proceeds of corruption in France, and it was Sherpa and our chapter in France which managed to present a claim and to have him convicted. So it is difficult, but we have to avoid the hypocrisy of having the money there without doing anything. And in relation with Sudan, I think that multilaterals, for instance, can help in establishing certain conditionalities when they offer money for that kind of countries. But I'm not sure that the conditionalities of money coming from multilaterals are really effective, because sometimes they are just in the papers, in the books, and it's like laws. We have the perfect clause saying that we should not use the money for this or that, and we will put in force the agencies or the rules or whatever it is. But then the reality is that the government is involved in using the money from the donors in a corrupt way. So it's difficult even if we use conditionalities. Yesterday I was in one of the multilateral bank here talking about corruption and trying to fix out how we can work. And in one moment, one of the vice president of the bank says, well, stop about talking morals, and we will do the economic equation here, and that's all. And I was really surprised, because if we don't talk about the morals, we won't get the right solution here. The morals are at the core of this problem. But I was really shocked talking about the multilaterals saying, well, don't care about, he said, don't care about asset recovery. We won't recover anything. We have to say, okay, past is past, and now we look forward. And in 10 years, we will meet and say, okay, past is past, and now we look forward. And that's not the solution of the problem.
Alina?
Well, first, I'm very much afraid that in 10 or 20 years we'll meet, so I look at the optimistic aspect of here. We will still be around, okay, to meet, all right? Although the rest I really cannot really promise, because, you know, it's not time which delivers, but it's right human agency in time, people who are prepared to take advantage of certain windows of opportunity, which sometimes exist, sometimes not. But still, you know, the preparation must exist, even if it's not there. I was quite impressed in Uruguay that they used the dictatorship years to think, you know, if the country would not be run by generals, what would we do the next day? You know, and they were among the very few people who were prepared, you know, like Estonians during Soviet Union. We all lost our time during Soviet Union doing various things, generally, you know, reading philosophy, doing literature. This was very popular with us, okay? But it's just them who actually thought, you know, what does rule of law mean? What kind of law should we have instead of this by essence corrupt Soviet system, you know? And when the change came, they just wrote over a weekend their government laws, and they implemented them. Government laws which should be simply copied in Ukraine or in other parts, but people don't do that. You know, they don't do that because it's not in their best interest to do that. But coming to the Paradise paper question, you know, there's this paradox. In charts, all these Caribbean are the only countries which really progressed in the past 15 years. You know, I do not include them simply due to their status of fiscal paradise, because in fact, all our measurements and charts are biased because they're based on this concept of boundaries of nation state. If we would put some sort of correction for cross-border corruption, like, you know, I am decent inside, but I'm actually money laundering other people's corruption, then the charts would look quite different. And we're thinking of creating actually a weight for our index of public integrity for this, that you can implement on top. So all the Caribbeans evolved a lot. But that's not negative. In fact, what they did is that they used the money for money laundering to pay better their, you know, their people in the administration and whatever. Corruption and poverty are very closely connected. If you're poor, there is no choice than being corrupt. It basically means that your people can be abused, that whoever has authority can extract a lot disproportionately from taking taxes from the many to just give to the poor. And therefore, if a country can come by money in any way, this will actually help it build control of corruption. You know, so I don't think that any solution which puts the weight on Caribbean islands and says, oh, we're going to sanction you, we're going to destroy you because you're doing this, I don't think the solution is morally correct. And I think indeed, as you suggested, that countries like United States or UK, they should do more to prevent their people who use these windows of opportunity to evade all of other places in the world. And I'm concerned that it seems that the discussion presently it is actually the other way around. You know, and not only the discussion on sanctions. I mean, I think all the proposals that I hear is about how to sanction the Caribbeans. Or all the proposals that I hear on beneficial ownership is how to ask Nigeria to create registers of electronic beneficial ownership. I mean, come on, Nigeria doesn't have a good register of property. In general, property is not protected. We always ignore the fact that they have an autochthonous system of property, that informal rulers actually distribute property there. I mean, at least we should take this opportunity of helping them do the rest of this instead of just doing something for ourselves, this register of beneficial, and for the rest letting them deal with the fact that they never had and never will have clear property rights, when this is actually the number one thing in countries where you want to have good control of corruption. So I think it's clear what we want to do. The question is, who wants to do this, really, And I had another,
We're going to ask Frank how we're going to incentivize the private sector.
So Ms. Sherman, that your experience in Serbia, the question is an incredibly difficult question, because the answer is there is no really clear answer. So if there aren't external sort of pressures to bring to bear on companies, so in value chains, the prospect of access to cheaper credit in foreign investors, and the companies are, say, mid-size, 50 employees or so, so typically we'll make the argument, okay, so you can enjoy a competitive advantage if you have a strong anti-corruption compliance program in place, and your interlocutors would appreciate that, and all things being equal, you can beat out your competitor. That's one argument we make. Another argument we make is that studies show that if you have good corporate governance in place, and that if an aspect of that is a strong anti-corruption program, that in the long term you'll be more profitable and sustainable. Typically those arguments don't work very well. So that's a huge, huge challenge, that segment of the market. But if you go below that, and if you're looking, say, at sole proprietors, owner-operators at a market, then we do have some traction, because you then encounter a situation where it's almost as though you're organizing workers into a union, And so we have had success, often working with the Solidarity Center, in giving those business owners, very, very small, a sense of what their rights are, how they can act collectively to improve their situation, push for reform, et cetera, et cetera. So your question's a great one. I don't have a very good answer for it, and perhaps somebody else
Lena,
does.
just a word, I just had to add something on this business thing. So I think two things here, really. One thing is that we should stop doing things which are useless but very costly. I mean, this is before addressing. No, please believe me that due to the explosion of anti-corruption in the past 15, 20 years, there are quite now a significant amount of money in anti-corruption. So in other words, there are the classic corruption rents, but also the anti-corruption rents have grown terribly. And one of the things which are going around are, for instance, this compliance industries and under industries like this. You would be surprised, or maybe many of you maybe even know, how much money are in these completely useless things, and how many businesses actually bought themselves diplomas of good behavior just by attending compliance seminars and whatever. So if you go to a country like Serbia, I'm sure they did a lot on business, and they have some proofs and some budgets actually spent by some agencies to show that they've done something. So I think it's actually fairer, when you cannot do nothing, to do nothing. Out of this money on anti-corruption, we can definitely do more things, buy textbooks for kids, or tablets, or do other things which are more useful. But this being said, it doesn't mean that there's nothing which can be done. I return to the example of Sudan. The moment when you have strong competition, Russia and China appear in the picture, and they offer as much money with you without conditions, it's probably too late to do anything. It means that you missed your window of opportunity. But in Serbia, which I know well, it's not the Russian money which makes Serbia corrupt. In Serbia, we made a lot of mistakes, and I think in Serbia there are still quite a lot of opportunities. And one thing that we can do is to simply, for instance, when you give money like EU gives to Serbia, is to put conditions of transparency of procurement to everyone to whom you give money, and those should be, ex ante conditions. Municipalities should just publish how much of their procurement is competitive, and who falls between a line should just not qualify to any money. But in order to this, I would say that first, people who grant money, international donors of every kind, they should start by giving an example by publishing their grants and by publishing their procurement. So show to them as you would like them to see organized. That would be an end to hypocrisy if you want to make a mark in this country.
Great, thank you. I'm going to take two more questions at the very back of the room, and then Matt, I'm afraid you had your hand up before you, I'm afraid, and then we're pretty much out of time. So at the back of the room first.
Yes, Will Ferragaro, consultant on conflict governance and media. One of the trends of the last 10, 15 years has been the explosion of right to information laws. And I'm wondering if the panel could address the role of right to information and anti-corruption, particularly in terms of thinking about empowering local organizations and individuals, as well as strengthening media to hold government accountable and investigate corporations, as well as to kind of localize anti-corruption in those areas. Thank you.
Okay, and then Matthew Murray over here. Oh, was it Matthew? I'm sorry, I had my glasses on.
I think I'm going to ask Matt, I'm sorry.
I had my glasses on, I couldn't see.
Matt, I think I'm going to ask you a question.
Yeah.
Mike J. Jeets, adjunct faculty at George Mason University, where I teach peace and civilian ops. And I want to address the issue, if I understand the assertion correctly, that there have been no successful cases of international interventions to change the nature of corruption from your metric of success being from where it's the norm to where it's the exception. And in my work, I use a different metric of success. In fact, in my work, which was also based on case studies, criminalized power structures are the leading obstructionist threat for peace and civilian ops. 75% of UN missions since 1990 have been obstructed by that criminalized power structure. So the issue I wanted to actually really ask Dr. Ferreira Rubio about, you said that one of the leading trends was state capture, gross corruption, and that one of the things you mentioned was CSIG and MAXI as ways of dealing with that. But in your recommendations, you didn't mention hybrid courts or hybrid justice institutions as a new tool that could be used. You mentioned strengthening justice institutions. So my question is, would you regard the relatively new tool of, like CSIG, where the international community has used hybrid, in this case, in CSIG, hybrid prosecutors, but hybrid justice institutions to address the impunity problem, whether that might be a way ahead in trying to combat the impunity that obstructs our efforts?
Thank you. Matthew was just raising that with me right before the session, so that was perfect. Sorry about that. All right, so we got two questions to finish up on. The right to information, which I think we've been talking a little bit about earlier, but in particular for local media and civil society, and where is that balance and what is the potential there? And then this notion of hybrid institutions, hybrid courts, where there's often been talk of international anti-corruption courts, for instance, and other things as potential solutions to this. So where do we all fall on those two issues? I'm going to start with, work our way down with Frank to begin with, and Delia, we'll let you wrap up at the end.
Okay.
So on right to information, we found that in the construct of this new project that looks to very, very quickly react to opportunities, that specifically in the case of the Gambia, where you had a change in government about 11 months ago, a small country, 1.8 million people, that we can go in to that country, working with Transparency International and working with the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, and for not much money, engage investigative journalists who are quite talented, lived in exile during the 22-year dictatorship, have access to social media, and really push change along purely by bringing to the light of day how the government budget is allocated and where money is going. It's a very small environment. You've got a key cadre of investigative journalists. You've got an NGO community that has some capacity, not much, to actually act upon what is revealed, to offer remedies. So your question is a very, very good one, because when you're looking for sort of quick, low budget ways to take action, that right to information is crucial. Without that, we probably would not have gone into Gambia and would not have chosen that as our first pilot project.
Helena?
Well, we have some evidence on this. Of course, I am a believer because I promoted the freedom of information laws all through the Balkans, starting with my country. But I can tell you that except my country, which happens to be Romania, I have never seen it working anywhere else. So, you know, in Croatia, in Serbia, in Albania in particular, where they have a very old information law, it never made much difference. And this is probably why, when I grew older and I had research money, I was able to test it for the rest of the world. And it's really not very significant. And this is because there are many cases like Albania where a law was adopted, but it was actually effectively never used. While in Romania, only me and my colleagues, let alone the rest of the world, I was in court over 100 times on this, opening all kind of precedents. And this is what makes a difference. So, and in our stats, what comes out is that freedom of information becomes significant if you have civil society or if you have freedom of the media. Fiscal transparency, however, which is another form of transparency, is significant in itself, even without, it explains about 16% of the variation. However, if you combine it again with either freedom of the media, we call this interaction in statistics. It's basically two things acting together. Or freedom of the media becomes very, very powerful. So yes, the solution is have freedom of information, but for someone, you should think for the start, this institutional tool is going to be used by what army? If the army is missing, it's not going to be, you know, much help to you, basically. And the other question was on?
Hybrid institutions.
Hybrid institutions and the power of the judiciary. Well, again, I have to give, so by all means, you know, if you can clean other countries of their corrupt, go ahead and do it. But as part of my experience, and other people may have worked in the Balkans, I have seen Kosovo, which was directly ruled by us, international community, or Bosnia. And I really cannot say that we made any difference. Actually, I have seen very bad cases of corruption in the international community there. So I think that the success that we have in Central America might actually be so far an exception. I mean, if we can do this anywhere else. And also, you know, let's not overestimate, it's wonderful and it's great to curb culture of impunity. Speaking as a Romanian, all the prime ministers with whom I have been in court, first they dragged me in court, they were in jail afterwards. You know, so our turn came historically to send them to jail. We have sent 18 ministers in jail for the past 5 years, which is like a whole government, right? But if a country is corrupt, and if you do not address, if governments don't help the judiciary a little bit with reforms, this doesn't help you very much. More than half of them are already out. They got early pardon for writing academic work in jail, misinterpreting some regulation, right? They were never academics in their private lives, but in jail where they have no internet and library, they all, you know, and it's 1 month off your sentence if you write an academic book. 22 public universities help them vouch that this is real academic work, and a countless number of judges who sat on these pardon boards said, well, who am I to judge if this person who's actually an illiterate, one is an illiterate, and one of his academic works, he's the owner of the major soccer club, Steaua, in Bucharest. One of his academic works was a photo picture of his family, and how they became to have the largest number of sheep in Romania, okay? And he went off. So, you know, don't overestimate the judiciary. It's great to curb culture of impunity and putting people to jail, but unless you cut the opportunities of other people to do the same in the same time when you put someone else in jail, that's not very sustainable.
Delia,
I completely agree.
the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It has been a pleasure to have this conversation with Aline and Frank and all of you regarding access to information. They are very important. We need the laws of access to information. But as Alina says, if no one is using that tool, the tool is useless. And we have to have civil society organizations and the press using that kind of tool. And many governments pass the laws of access to information and then puts lots of constraints in the real access to information. For instance, in my country, in Argentina, we have fought for years to have an access to information law. Now we have one. And the principle is informality, so no formality to access to information. And you know that the regulation, in order to put that in force, that has taken the government 1 whole year, established that you have to reveal your fiscal keyword or password in order to access to information. In order for the government to know what are you asking, who are you asking? So it's a way of destroying the access to information law. They are necessary, as I say, as laws, but what is important is implementation, enforcement, and in this case, the use of that. Because in a way, this is targeted transparency. Transparency, not just for the sake of having the information, but for using the information to certain objective. And this has to do also with open government partnership that is misinterpreted in many countries as open data. So they overwhelm citizens with websites full of information, very difficult to read, very unusable information, and they say, okay, we have done with the OGP standards. And they forget about participation, because OGP is information for the sake of participation, of having the information in order to take part of the decision-making process and the monitoring of public policies. So governments should be aware of that, and we should be asking governments to have that in mind. Regarding your very interesting question about hybrid judiciary structures, I agree with Alina. In particularly, I don't know, in Honduras, I have been working there, and they are starting really. I don't know what the success can be. We have just faced a very complicated election, so the situation is complicated in the country. The CICIG in Guatemala was a very useful tool, but I don't think it is possible to create the same structure in other countries, even in Central America. El Salvador was trying to do such an exercise, and the reaction from the legal community there, and not only from the government, was very against this kind of introduction of international paternalistic way of fighting corruption. So there are good examples, but I don't think they are reproducible without taking care of the context where they are applied.
Thank you so much. I want to apologize to our audience for going a bit over. We got a late start this morning, but I think we've been rewarded with a very rich discussion from our panelists, and I'd like to thank both Frank and Alina for contributing, and to wish you the best of luck in your term.
Thank you very much.
I don't think much luck is needed. I think TI is in very good hands from what we've heard today, and wish you the best with your term.
Thank you very much.